I am Michele Leroux Bustamante, and I'm going to talk to you about authorization in .NET and a little bit about architecture practices at the end and challenges we typically run into in making decisions around the architecture. So I will start with saying authorization is hard, probably harder than your typical identity problem to solve. Usually because of the scale with which it usually traverses your applications and your systems with so many UIs and backends and multiple micro UIs and services and every single process essentially it touches. You have to think a lot about the architecture and the patterns and the design ahead of time. And there's also different approaches that people can take. We have, your typical role-based access control, which would be, I'm a user, I log in, I have roles. We map the roles to things we can do in the system. I can show and hide features in the application. I can enable and disable APIs, I might call. But that typically turns out to be problematic because roles become misused or they grow into multiple meanings. Now I need more roles. We've had some systems where people end up with literally hundreds of roles when all they really needed was more granular permissions tied to less roles, so that it was more manageable. And then that also gave you a little more flexibility. When the meaning of role changes, you don't have to change code because it just changes the permissions you get. So permission-based access control helps us with a more fine-grained approach to authorization and lets us think at the claim or permission level. And so there's that approach. And then we have attribute-based, which is really more about providing additional data to the evaluation. Things like, additional data about the user, their birth date, the time of day they logged in, other context that could be relevant to the evaluation. And then in addition, we have resource-based, which would be, how do I make a decision based on the resource I'm trying to access right now? So it's one thing to log in and find out, you're a user with these roles, and now I have these permissions, and those are typically, birthright assignments, meaning they're fixed, they're not conditional. And then we've got the conditional evaluations, which are the attributes or context. And then on top of that, we might have to look at, do I own the resource? Therefore, I'm allowed to access it. Do I belong to the company or tenant? Therefore, I'm allowed to do certain things within that tenant. So it becomes additional layers of what we would call context to add to the valuation choices. And then, of course, policy-based would allow you to combine all of these things into one thing so that you can ask different questions and evaluate based on, roles and permissions and attributes and other context and the resources we're trying to get to all at once. So these are all, again, complicated in the sense that you have to have an idea of your design and your plan so that you can imagine how this will traverse many, many services, many applications. So that's part of what makes authorization somewhat hard, is the thinking in advance and the planning. And then we've got just the fact that there's no one solution. If you look at a new system at every single company, it will be different, the way they've approached authorization. Some of them bake it into the application, completely custom. Others try to centralize it in its own system with a proper, solution that is auditing and providing compliance and regulatory considerations. And then there's so many things in the middle of those two extremes where they have them in the identity system or they have them in some other custom code that's external to the application and shared, but not a business system. In the past, we used to build systems on something called XACML, which is a terrible XML, language for authorization that typically was embedded in appliances like axiomatics in government with heavy use, not so popular with day-to-day programming, of course, because it was terrible to work with. And then, of course, now we have Authz, which is a new and up-and-coming protocol for interacting between your applications and the place you do authorization, which is really just trying to standardize every system you talk to that it talks the same language in case you have to talk to many, or so that people can write code and switch systems and it still works. This is still evolving, and so it's not really the point of the talk as much as to say there's a lot to think about when you get from here to the idea of writing code and authorizing to what do we want to do to scale across our entire system or ecosystem. Okay, so many things to think about. But, let's start with just the fact that it's design intensive, which means the thinking has to happen somewhat up front. And of course, we have to overlay that with the how. What can I do in my actual code, depending on the tools I'm using? So we're going to focus on some of the things we can do in .NET. So I'm going to start with authorization is not equal to authentication or vice versa, right? So authentication is who are you? I've logged in, you have my user ID, you have information, maybe a few claims about me, my email address, whether I'm active or not, what my user state is, the time that I logged in, things like that. But typically it should not contain anything to do with my authorization in a perfect world, because of course, my identity system, is issuing tokens carrying small number of claims, and we don't want to bloat the tokens with tons of roles and permissions because that's a problem as well. So we typically like to separate the concern from you are authenticated from you now have to collect information about what are you allowed to do, because that can grow as you go to each application and API. So just starting with that coupling that we frequently see people do, I'll just say that, again, what happens when you couple authentication and authorization also becomes, the idea of role explosion, where you suddenly are adding more and more roles to make up for the fact you don't have permissions, because usually identity systems just deal with roles. And so now we're, again, new meanings to authorize over here and there. We have new roles, more roles. Now we have hundreds of roles. The thing about token bloat is the bigger problem. When I authenticate to an identity system and come back, if the tokens are too big, then during the redirect cycle, the browser just doesn't know how to handle those cookie sizes or those token sizes. Even if it's a server-side redirect, eventually there's a cookie involved within those redirects. And that frequently gets blocked by API management or other gateways or firewalls because they have limits. And even just recently, Azure had a firewall, or Azure APIM changed to the size of the headers, and a bunch of folks that we work with that are doing authorization using identity server and some other, again, token sizes that were extreme, suddenly stopped working until they fixed the setting. So things like that can happen. We want to avoid that. The other thing is, how long should the user's permissions or roles be valid? Caching and invalidation becomes a thing. And if you're logging in and you have an SSO session, those claims are fixed in the JWT or in the token. And now, how long should that be valid? If I'm using that token to all of these APIs during my session, what if we change my permissions? What if we take me out of a role? There's all this caching to think about as well. So again, lots of these are reasons why we don't want to couple authentication and authorization. We also don't want our identity system to be polluted with business logic around why I have a role or not, or how I assign a permission. And so again, just the idea is if you can keep it clean, keep authorization out, identity is pure, authorization is a different problem to solve. Equally as hard, maybe even harder, but at least don't couple them. So each application will have different ways to handle the authorization once we've decided, okay, I have a user, now let's find out what they can do, let's gather their roles, permissions, claims. So we might, again, just require that the user's authenticated and check that they have the right scope for a token, for an API in their token. That would be an identity concern. That's fine. When we get to API scopes, again, also an identity concern, but it's authorization of really the application calling the API, not the person or the user. And then we get into roles, permissions, claims, and then other rules that we might have in context. So the extreme, of course, being centralizing management to a third-party system. So let's go ahead and just talk. I'm going to do a bunch of demos showing many different ways to do this. I wanted to provide you with some context up front before. So, the basics that we will always see is you're probably going to, in your application, set up OpenID Connect login to an identity system. So we'll have your typical, add authentication, where you set up the scheme, and we're redirecting to an identity provider. And then we're going to indicate, obviously, which is the name and role claim, all of the basics for redirecting and setting up a session in the app before we do authorization. And then when we want to prevent access to anything that should not be anonymous, so imagine that my application has maybe a home page that's anonymous, but everything else requires authorization, at least that you're authenticated to start with, then I would add authorization and, inject into DI services whatever I need in there, like logging capabilities and other context. And of course, start by requiring authorization, which would give me default behavior. So what I want to talk about is, what do I get by default out of the box, and what can I do from there? The other thing that we might talk about is, again, how do I, if I protect the entire application with default authorization, start exposing some endpoints for anonymous access? And the old way back in the day was to use attributes. So, authorization data handlers that would allow you to say anonymous, or, imperatively ask for permissions or roles or other things. So we're going to have different ways that we might expose an anonymous endpoint. But we're not going to use attributes, because instead of the reflection-based of the past, now we have minimal APIs, and we have razor pages, which allow us to do inline, and it's actually compiled. So it's a different process than previously. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and do some demos. So let's see if you can see. Can everybody see that at the back? Or do we need to make it bigger? It's okay? A little bit bigger? All right. I didn't get a chance to do that while we were setting up in here, so up front needs the bigger. Yeah. Forgot the glasses today, right? Okay, so let me just get a font going here. Okay, sorry about that. Now I have to find my settings. And text editor, there we are, sorry. Maybe I need the glasses. So I'm going to make that 20. And it's probably going to be, not a lot of words on one page, but we'll be fine. Now we can see that, right? Okay. All right. So, and of course, I'm in the wrong browser. I'm in the wrong one. So maybe I should have done that over here. Can we see this? I think it's just the same size. All right, so what I have here is I have an application and an API. My user interface right here has a setup for identity, which we've already talked about. It's got, adding the razor pages. It's got add authorization, which is the default services, which will basically be make sure the user's authenticated. And then, of course, somewhere down here, we say we want to use authentication authorization, get it into the pipeline, and then we require authorization at the end. So what that will do is, by default, secure all of the pages. And what I'll do is just give this a run. So I think it's probably already running. So this is my web app. And what it'll do, this is running with Aspire, by the way, so I can get logs and things right here. So this is my web app here. And it's going to ask me to log in because, of course, all of the pages are protected. So if I log in as Alice, and, oops, I have to type her password correctly, Alice. Okay, I can type. So we've got a home page that tells me when I logged in. We've got, a couple other pages, one that shows my claims. You can see I've got a bunch of things coming back from identity because I've put all my roles and some features and tenant data, which we'll talk about. And then we got some buttons for calling APIs in different ways for authorization. So at the end of the day, these are the pages that I have accessible right now. So nothing really much to see there except for that it was protected until I authorized myself and authenticated. So because this default require authorization is applying to everything, then I'm going to need to go to my, index page. And if I want to allow anonymous, I can come in here and I can do the old way, right? So this is adding the attribute that will allow anonymous access. And if I just quickly break that and build and run it, and we'll run it again. So that'll refresh my Aspire here. And now this time it lets me in, but I have to sign out to prove that that'll work. So now I have access to the front page and it doesn't send me to log in until I go to the next page. And now I can be Bob, and Bob has less claims, but despite that, I can still get into these pages for now. Okay. All right. So all that did is illustrate that, allow anonymous is possible at the root, but this is also the attribute-based kind. So we're going to go back into my program CS here. And, again, this will do the default authorization, but it doesn't speak to, maybe having more granular for per page settings. And you don't do that at the map Razor pages because this actually is an all or nothing kind of application. So whatever we put here is for the entire suite of pages, because Razor pages is simpler than the MVC controller approach where you could go per method inside a controller. But the benefit of this approach is that we're doing it all in a declarative way elsewhere, and we could later do reports on where are all the places using the policies to do authorization, rather than having to go inside each page and check endpoints and things to figure it out. It can actually be done without doing that reflection. So we're going to scroll up here, and what I'll do is add, instead of doing add Razor pages this way, we'll do it this way. Oops, yeah. How many people love the IntelliSense in Visual Studio Code? Right? Okay, so what I can do instead is I can add options to make the index anonymous this way. And I can also do other things like add additional policy evaluation to different pages. I won't do that right now. I'm going to show that later. But bottom line is this is another way to apply on a per page basis if you like, so that you can get that granular list and have a way to discover it later. So I'm going to go ahead and break, and we'll build, and we'll run, and we'll go back here, and this will refresh. So maybe I have to click that again, and this will load it up again, and I can still get to this page, but I'm going to sign out and see if I can still get to it, and I can, but then it'll make me log in again, and I can go Bob, Bob, Bob. Okay. So, all right, so all I've really illustrated here is some basics, right? So we have the default policy. So when we think about the default policy, out of the box, it's, are you authenticated? That's it. Doesn't check any API scopes at the API. It doesn't check any other details. But there's also a thing called a fallback policy. The fallback policy does nothing. So if you don't apply the, require authorization here, then fallback policy says do nothing. So if you want a system that's secure by default, where you have to opt into the anonymous, then the ideal scenario would be to make the default policy match the fallback policy, which I'll show when I go to the API. So that's one sort of general tip. So right now what I have is the UI. I'm going to go to an API and show a different set of approaches here. So let's go in here. So for the API, we have a different setup for authentication where we're doing authorization with a bearer token. We're expecting to have a token that's valid and hasn't expired, and we're expecting that it comes from the same identity provider as the UI was authenticating to. So this will go ahead and map my role claim and my name claim and just make it possible for us to evaluate that in the user principal. So it'll hydrate a user principal, attach it to the context so that everywhere I go in the API, I can get access to that and validate whatever data I get out of the token. So when I add authorization here, it'll again add the default authorization policy. And then if I scroll down here, after using authentication and authorization, my next job is to create the endpoints. And so with minimal APIs, you don't do the controller where you have multiple, different controller endpoints where you're decorating those with authorization. Instead, we're actually mapping them here, and we can supply the policies we'd like to authorize. So right now, my default is going to be just to check that there's a token. But what I can do is I can start adding, what policies do I want to add here? Like, for example, require authorization. I could just say I would like to require that you have, a user role, for example, in your token. So let's see. I think, well, that's not true. No. There. Okay, I guess you have to type it harder. Something like that. So anyway, I have an API here. It's going to require authorization. It's going to require that I have a user role right now. And so, I have to have a user that has that role. Let's go ahead and run it again. And so my UI, when I log in as Alice, has admin and user. When I log in as Bob, I have a user role. When I log in as Chris, I'm going to have, neither of those. So what I'll do is I'll log out, log in. So we'll grab Chris. And then now you can see I have a guest role. I don't have a user role. So when I go to my claims, I can see what I have in the UI from my ID token. When I call, this endpoint, it says forbidden because I don't have the role that's being required. But if I sign out and sign it as somebody that has the user role, so we'll sign it as Alice, who has more superpowers, right? User and admin role down here. So we'll go ahead and call the API, and of course I get in, right? All it's doing is returning my claims. We're good to go. So all that's showing you is, okay, so I can go to the endpoints here and I can start identifying, policies for each one. Right now, this is saying, oh, and by the way, this is minimal API, so I can map the same code, which just returns the claim, to any number of routes I want. Just to keep it simple, that's what I did here. But the decoration for authorization doesn't happen in the code base where this is declared. So if we go to the endpoint, this is just a class, right? It's just just a method that you can apply to any number of endpoints. Okay. So basically, the first one is just require authorization there. So what I can also do is instead, I can start creating policies that are reusable. So this is where it gets a little bit more powerful. Up here, what I've done is add authorization without any specifics. But what I can do here, actually, I'll just do this here. The IntelliSense is awesome. Yeah. But I don't want to turn it off because sometimes it's actually good. So, okay. Yeah. So we'll just do this. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take just an example policy here. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to create a new sort of default policy, basically. So we'll do this. And yeah, I want to do it that way. Oh my gosh. There we go. Yeah. I'll get it right as soon as I get past the IntelliSense. You'd think it would be helpful. Okay, so let's do this. All right. And of course, one more. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is create a new policy. So instead of attaching to the endpoints individually, what I'm looking for here is you can create a policy builder and you can add one or more things to it. The default would have been add authenticated or require authentication for the user, but I also kind of want to make sure the API scope is there. So I want the API scope that I've passed from the identity in my token, that I'm validating that. And then of course I can add on to that the user should always require the user role at a minimum. I could just say that as a base requirement across the board. And then the other thing we can do is we have a default policy, but if you want to be secured by default, you may as well assign the fallback policy to the default policy, which means whatever that base policy is you're requiring, you're going to do that the same on both, okay? And I think I have to do this. And then oh my goodness, yeah. It's really annoying. Okay, so let's do that. Oh, thank God. Okay, so basically what I've done here is I've created a new policy that I've added as the default, which means it's going to apply to all of the endpoints. So I'm not using a named policy yet. And I'll go ahead and break that and build it and run that and go back. And we will refresh in here, which means this is already refreshed, so I can go home. Now I'm logged in as Alice, so I should have plenty of claims. So I've got my admin role, my user role. So if I call the API now, the first one, if you remember I called before, it said, I want you to have the user role. And I do, so I'm in. But these other ones were not protected before, and now they are, because I've added some more, I've added a better default. So what I'm going to do is try again, and now it'll log me in as Chris, who doesn't have any of those roles. He's a guest. So when I call APIs with Chris, I will get forbidden here, but I'll also now get forbidden on all of them because the default policy is requiring that. Now, if I come in here and make a change like API 2, maybe I misnamed the scope. So now I'm requiring this base scope to make sure that my APIs are secure. So I'll rebuild that and we'll run that. And now when I go back, and of course, this has to refresh, so it will. And then we'll come back in. Of course, click the link. And I'm logged in still as Chris, but now if I call any of the APIs, I'm still going to get errors. Probably the error could say something better, but basically I shouldn't. It's forbidden for a different reason because now the APIs are not going to be secured. So if I log in as Alice, I'm still going to have the same problem. So we'll go ahead and log in as Alice, who has all the claims, and we'll go like that. So we'll call the API. Oh, I lied. Oh, here it is. Okay, so yeah, the default policy, I should have been allowed in, but because the API, it's applied to that API, because I didn't provide a new policy to replace it, the default policy is being invoked, which is saying the wrong API scope. So it's only failing on these two because the other one has its own policy, which didn't include the API scope, if that makes sense. So anytime you place a policy, it overrides the default, which overrides the fallback. Okay. All right, so let's go back. So now, good idea to have a default and a fallback. Probably not a good idea to require a role in there. Maybe a good idea to require your API in there and that your user's authenticated. So we can make a change there. So what I would like to do then is start looking at how do we add policies that can be, reused. So what if I had an admin endpoint? I want to make sure that the endpoint is called only by people that have the admin role. So I can create a new policy. So when you call configuration add policy, what you're doing is you're adding into the pipeline another policy to be, evaluated. And so I'm not adding it yet. I'm just configuring it. We're going to place in the pipeline by attaching it to one of the methods. Okay. And so when I require admin policy, that is the name of the policy. And I'm just saying require role, which is something that you can do. You can also do that in other ways. You can say require claim. And that could say, role admin, right? That was a good IntelliSense moment. And then you can, do like additional things like add requirements, and then create a new instance of something that is called a requirement. So all of these are equivalent behaviors that are asking for the admin role. I don't have to do all of them. I'm just showing you interchangeably that require claim is there, require role is there, and all those is examples of essentially requirements. So if I take a look at the definition of that, it's an authorization requirement. So that's the infrastructure beneath all of this. When you create a requirement separately from the actual handler for the requirement, you're able to inject things like loggers and other context with DI. If you create an admin requirement without separating it from the handler, so where the authorization requirement is bundled with the handler, then you can't inject any DI. So really, you'll typically separate these things for more flexibility. And the idea here is it's just saying IsInRole admin, right? So I'm kind of hard coding this is an attribute and an authorization requirement that only applies to one role, not very flexible, but illustrating how the base works, okay? Whereas this one with DI is separating it, okay? And inside, again, is still doing the IsInRole. It's just, now I can have a logger and other things that I inject with DI. So that gives you a bit of color. So here, what we're going to do is, again, I can do require role, I can do require claim, I can do add requirements, any of those things. And now it's not going to be used until I apply the policy somewhere. So what I'm going to do is scroll down to where we set up the map. And I can go ahead and in here, add the admin policy, for example, okay? And then here I can say, add admin claim policy. So again, all I'm doing is showing that each of these endpoints, one of them is just looking at the token, which is why it was called token on the button. This is saying I'm going to evaluate roles. This is saying I'm going to evaluate claims. And it's just showing different ways to apply the policy. So let's go up here and we'll grab a claim policy right here. Again, simple example of the same. So I have this policy here for requiring admin, and now I'm going to have a separate policy for requiring admin by claims. So this is writing it in line where I'm doing the require claim that I showed you up here. Okay. All right. So let me give that a run, and then we'll look at some other things. This is really short. Kind of have to do this. Okay. So, looks like that's ready. And here I am. So I am logged in as Alice, who has all the power. When I call this API and that API, those first two are happy. Actually, role and claims and token are all happy because I have all the roles. I can do all of these things, right? And that's because when I look at my claims, you can see I have all these roles and features and things. So I'm going to sign out. I'm going to log back in as Bob. And Bob is going to only have the user role. So we can go to Bob and we can try this guy, and I have the user role, so I got in. Oh, actually we took it out anyways. So that's just checking now my token is the right scope and I'm authenticated. This one I'm forbidden, and this one I'm forbidden because both of those are asking for admin, okay? All right, so having done that, again, all these are just examples of configuring a policy. The point is, you want to do the configuration, you want to be able to reuse it, so then you have to think about how do I want to bundle these things. So if I scroll down a little bit further, something else we can do is we can do something of an external policy. So instead of having the policy, coming from my claims, because so far I'm showing you doing what I said not to do, which is, we're putting things in the token that have features and have roles and have, additional data about the user, which would be just their normal claims. So we want to get away from that. So we want to think about, where do I go and get policy? And there are different tools for that, right? You can use OPA, which would be a way to invoke a policy and get a decision. You can use things like, just your own custom code and load. I have a little tool that loads it from it's just going to load a JSON, right? And it's going to pull that policy in. So what I'm going to do is create this thing called an external policy. And what this will do is, call the external policy requirement. So if we go to the definition of that, there's a list of permissions it's going to look at. It's got an external policy requirement, which is just a marker class for the requirement itself, so I can use it in code. And then that leads to the handler, which again is going to load up some policies from config. So that's going to load up the local policy. It's going to inject that with DI, so it's loaded once and pulled in. So you can imagine if you had a policy cache or something like that, where something else, an engine, is loading up as you go through the system, additional data about what you're allowed to do throughout the features of the system, then you can inject accessing that cache into a central policy handler that can access the cache to do those things. And then you can make those permissions or roles expire in the cache so that they're not there forever. If maybe some of them should have rules like it's only valid for 15 minutes, for example, and then we got to refresh against the database so that you're not holding on to your permissions all day in case you were removed from the company or something. Okay. So basically it's centralizing everything. And what it's doing in here, just as an example, is instead of calling a cache, loading from the JSON, and then somewhere in here, obviously, we're going to, check to see. We're going to get the permissions from the metadata of the endpoint, which I'm going to show you in a second. So the job of this policy and the endpoint configuration is that you can decorate your endpoints and say which permissions I need. So instead of doing roles, instead of doing claims, instead of bundling those into an attribute or a requirement, we now have the concept of the requirement is a flexible, reusable thing that looks at the metadata on the endpoint, just like Swagger would be metadata, right? And it will check what do I need and enforce against that. Okay. So this is where that happens, right in here, right? So we're going to check the permissions. And then as long as we haven't failed, we're going to go ahead and evaluate and see if we have the right permissions. And as long as we have them, we can succeed. So that's the idea. Now, if I go back into program, this definition is just saying, hey, here is the external policy requirement that you can apply using external policy as a name. So let's come down here and let's add the external policy requirement as a transient object, right? So we've got that injected so that we can use it. I didn't show that earlier for the admin requirement DI handler. So when you separate the requirement from the handler, then you also need to, instantiate the handler in the DI system here, okay? And then lastly, what I'm going to do is show you sort of a different thing here, and that is, okay, so let's say we want to bundle endpoints so that they all have a default policy at the top for all of the sort of the root and all of the sub routes. So you have index, WAC, and then you have all the other endpoints underneath, right? So say you have a feature tree, feature 1, area, 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 feature 2, area, area, area. You could have a default policy for feature 1 and feature 2 where it knows where to go get the policy just for that area of the application, and it can load that into the cache separately from feature 2, separately from feature 3, and you can start to scale this out with your design. And the point is, you can still make, so what this is doing is it's saying, let's do the default require authorization. Default policy will be invoked here. And remember, default policy is checking the API token and that user's authenticated above, because I've already written that as a new default policy. And then so this group will be, everything from the root of the group, right? And what I'm doing here is saying, okay, so the default is just my index, which is list claims, which we started with before. And then I have my WAC roles, my WAC claims, and my WAC policy. So 3 different endpoints. They're all returning claims, so the code inside is irrelevant. It's just I've got a route that's going to invoke that code, but it's not going to get there if I don't pass authorization first. So I still have the require admin and the claim policy, and now I've got the new external policy that will be invoked for this WAC policy endpoint. And so notice that we have with metadata. So now I can add, color to the data available to the endpoint, and it's all declarative here, which means, again, we've generated in the past some tools where we go and inspect and can report all of the different endpoints and the required permissions for them and the policies they use in a single view, just using like a unit test even. You can just traverse the system and output that, which makes it really convenient as developers to sort of have a sense of what are we actually doing in the code instead of having to go look at each MVC controller and looking at the attributes and trying to decipher all of that, right? So it's quite handy. So the metadata here is really just adding to it that we're using a policy where I'm loading, the information for the permissions. So let me go and show you where that is. One sec. Okay. So hang on, I just have to find my, here, app settings. There we go. Permissions evaluation is my local policy. And it's basically got a, I'm receiving identity roles, admin, and I'm going to map that to a role that's my application role. So the idea is identity system, or Entra ID or wherever you log in might tell you you're in the marketing department or engineering department or some basic roles that are part of the business. We never want to couple our authorization behavior to business things that could change. So instead, we map it to what my application cares about. How do I want to group my permissions? What are I going to name my roles? What's my convention? And then with that, we can, have a new application role from the identity role. Typically, that's how you would do it. And so we're going to have anybody who's an admin has the app admin role. Anybody who's a user gets the app user role. The subject IDs here, 1 is Alice, 2 is Bob. Chris doesn't get anything. The permissions that I'm assigning are based on the role. So the user's getting read, the admin's getting list, and so on, okay? So what this is doing is applying my permissions. Okay, just again, a simple example just so that we can illustrate. So this external policy is going to read the policy from the JSON. It's telling it which one, because there could be many. And then it's going to require that you have list permission to get in to the endpoint. So remember, Chris doesn't have list, only Alice is going to have list. So that's what we'll do. I'm going to break this here. Okay. And we'll give it a compile. All right. So let that refresh. And we will try it again. So I'm Bob right now. which means, I'm allowed in here, I'm allowed not here, right? So my policy won't work because I'm Bob. I'm going to log in as Alice, and Alice is going to have more privileges. And so now we know Alice has admin, which means she's going to get app admin, which means she's going to get the permissions we need. So we're going to call APIs, call data, and we're in, right? So again, that's just illustrating again that this central thing now can have decoration on the APIs, tell you which permissions, tell you which policy to evaluate. That could be done in lots of different ways. Again, if you're using OPA, you can do it that way. If you're using another tool that's an external authorization tool, you might be able to use the same concept. So you're wrapping all that up, the other logic in terms of where we go to validate inside that evaluator. Okay. All right. So a couple other things. So I want to get to we're going to go through a couple of other things. I'll give you an idea. So we're going to look at step up because you can use these authorization structure or infrastructure for step up authentication as well. Like you don't have MFA redirect. You can also decorate your UI. So we have some other problems still to solve, right? Just adding requirements is not enough to figure out how do I apply this across all my APIs or all my UIs or all my pages that have buttons and things that I want to hide and show. The other thing to consider is that these are decision-based, right? The whole logic behind the authorization components in ASP.NET Core here is it's decision-based. So it's not really returning you a list of permissions or roles that you can use to hide and show things, which means it's going to get pretty chatty when we think about how do I apply this to a UI and make it scale. So it may not be the best thing for that level of detail. Okay for APIs because you can cache the results and have them expire after a time, but not necessarily okay for I have a whole bunch of things I need to hide and show right now, and I need to kind of get all that data at once, which means I need multiple decisions, right? So just something to think about contextual, or in terms of context and applicability. So what I want to do now is, again, we've got this concept of the metadata. The other thing that I want to do is look at the concept of feature area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this guy. So this is just illustrating the power of, also the minimal API and the fact that you can have routes and layers and dynamic routes. So I have, for example, maybe features, and I might have feature A, B, C, feature 1, 2, 3, whatever their names are. And what I'd like to do is create an authorization policy that's able to take whatever feature comes in and have that, look up based on the feature. So if I build a path from features, feature 1, features, feature 2, then I want that path to be able to, authorize based on my central authorization system that might have configured what roles I have in those areas. So I need a place that I can scale that and manage that. So I used the JSON as an example of loading something. And I'm going to quickly use Policy Server to show like a UI so I can illustrate turning something on and off and have that work, because that's easier. But the point is you can do that with OPA, you can do that with custom code, you can do that with external systems. And so the progression you're seeing here is I can write little bits of code that say, I require this role, I require this permission, and I can make those reusable, and I can put them in a shared library, or I can put them in a YARP, proxy and have it check before we get to the API, or a sidecar in containers. That's all fine. But ultimately, when you get to a certain scale, you actually want it out of the application and into a centralized place that you can manage and audit and have some level of controls, like maybe even a roll-up, like at this point in time, that user had these snapshot roles when the incident happened, ... So again, there's the, simple, just I need to secure my app approach. There's the I need to scale it to multiple APIs and apps, and I might need to put it into, again, a shared area like the YARP proxy or sidecar. And then that custom code is, going somewhere. Even if it's OPA, you have to write all of that. And then there's I'm using a system. So that's the progression. So in this case, I'm looking at having features and routes, having them essentially authorized. And what we're saying here is, so I want you to have either the admin role to get in here, or you have to have the read or list. This is just a little mini DSL. The code's in the sample, so you can see that too. That's not really relevant to authorization. It's just convenient for reading, so it might be fun to look at later. So basically, again, I've got that list feature area endpoint, and that's just going to be some code that returns some data based on you getting past the authorization gate. So not much to look at there. The most important thing is the authorization piece, because what we're going to do is we're going to go down to evaluate and have that use like a tool that can go to a centralized system. So I'm using Policy Server as the example for this. So let me just illustrate something for you here. So I have like a policy called features. It's got feature 1 and 2. If I go to features and I take a look at, the roles that I've defined, I've got admin and user. And if I look at admin, I can see that, Alice is assigned to admin, which means she's going to inherit under feature 2 that same role, right? So she's inherited. And then ultimately what I want to do is see, what permissions I'm going to get. Well, if I'm Alice, I'm getting all the permissions because the admin role is assigned all these permissions. And then if I go to feature 1 and I go to user, then we see Bob has been granted the user role under feature 1. And then if we go to feature 2, then we're going to see Chris has been granted the user role under feature 2. So we're looking at feature areas in the application and what I should be able to see based on a policy that's external so that we can, demonstrate that. So I'm not sure if I compiled this, so I'm just going to do that real quick. And actually, let's make sure I've added all the things I needed to add. So what I was showing you here is adding another route separately from the group and giving it a policy to execute against, which is the, authorize with policy for server builder. So this is another way to build. Instead of just requirements, you have a builder that produces the entire stack for authorization. And then up here, let's see. I want to illustrate that we have a runtime client to call it. I want to illustrate that we have a centralized policies requirement handler, right? So this handler here is, the handler that is being used to sort of tee up the policy server parts, right? So basically, it's going through the metadata and it's getting the route, features, WAC, feature 1, features, WAC, feature 2. So it's building the route from the actual map. And then it's using that to go and evaluate the policy for that path, whatever the policy path is, and pass in the user for context. So now we're using context-based because we're passing in user context, profile data, whatever. And we're using policy-based and the route. And we can also use tenant-based, like if you're in tenant 1 or tenant 2, do you have access? Because that's additional context you can do in some of these other utilities. So bottom line is now we've got our kind of everything set up as it should be. I'm going to make sure I've compiled, and then I'll go ahead and run it again. So security is exciting, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's see. I'll go back to the UI. My claims are I'm Alice, so I got lots of features. I'm gonna go to policy server evaluation. I go to feature 1, I go to feature 2, I get in. So that just means it works, right? So let's see it not work. So I'll go in as Bob, and Bob doesn't have, well, he's got feature 1. So Bob should be able to get into feature 1, but he can't because something's wrong. So now we have to figure out why. And then I'm going to log in as Chris. Okay, so Chris, and he's not getting in either. So let's go see what could be going on here. So I'm going to go into my permission assignments, and didn't we say we needed the list assignment, right? So under feature 2, I'm adding the list assignment, and now I'm going to go back in, and I guess I'll run that again. And now feature 2 works. So centralized policy, change whatever you need to, dynamically gets the update, right? So it's not cached or anything. Which means now if I log in as Bob, as long as he's got feature 2, it should work for him too. So let's go back as Bob, and we'll see if he's got feature 2, and he doesn't. So that means somewhere in here, you know, when we look at feature 2 and we look at the user role, it's only Chris. And we look at feature 2 and we look at the admin role, it's only Alice. So that's why Bob doesn't get in, you see? So if I were to add a user and put Bob and then come back again, then I can get feature 2. See what I mean? So all that does is show you how to wrap up, you know, into a reusable component. So we've gone through simple requirements. We've gone through adding them to the map. We've gone through having the map for the API actually structure hierarchy and metadata that you can read from with the policy. We've talked about, you know, putting the code in place here, loading it from a JSON or AKA whatever you like, including potentially a third-party thing where it's a system. So all those things are possible, right? And then the other thing that I want to do here is I want to take a quick journey back to the UI, where we really only did a couple of basic things at first. So let's go here. And one of the things I want to do is take out the authorization that was the default. And what I'm going to do is add authorization and add a policy called recent login. So what it's going to do is expect me to have logged in within a minute. I'm also going to add a features policy, and its job is going to be to allow us to have feature requirements for, you know, each of the pages and buttons that we can apply either to an endpoint, or in this case, what I'm going to do is add a tag on the actual Razor page that will prevent access to a button based on the feature. So, so first of all, this is going to do a step-up authentication for me. So we'll try that out. And then what I want to do is add the feature. So we got our feature requirement handler. Oh. So the feature requirement handler is going to be showing, just checking that I have a certain role to the feature. So I guess we're not going to, that's not teaching anything much new that we already looked at, but it's going to be applied somewhere, which is why I want to show that. And then down here, we've already got all of these. Oh, wait, am I in the API again? Sorry, that's not where I want to be. I think that's why I was confused. Let me just make sure I didn't. No, I think that just popped me over. This is where I was. Yeah, this is where I was. Okay, so feature. Then we have, let's see. And then we have the basic require authorization. Okay, that's fine. And then lastly, what I want to do is I want to add the tag. So let me go to security here somewhere. I have a tag helper. So its job is to let me attach tags to, you know, Razor resources that I've applied. So I can have an AZ policy saying what policy to evaluate, and I can have an AZ resource indicating the thing I'm validating against, like feature 1, feature 2, et cetera. And then what this will do in here is when it processes, it takes the attributes out so they don't render, and then it checks the authorization against the user, the resource, and the policy name. And if it succeeds, we continue. And if not, it suppresses the output, which hides the button so that it doesn't appear. So now what I'm going to do is go to the call APIs, and I'm going to uncomment this guy because he's ready to go. Time of the essence. And so what this is doing is you can see AZ policy feature. So I'm executing the features policy, and I'm saying the resource is feature 1. So if I have feature 1, I should see this custom button, and if I don't have feature 1, I won't see the button, right? That's the idea. And then, so the feature requirements handler is just being used by the AZ tag helper to tie it all together. So let me go ahead and build that. Okay. And here we go. So first and foremost, let's sign out and sign in again. So I'm going to be Alice at first. And Alice has all the features. So, she always has everything. So we're not calling APIs this time. We're actually going to the API button. And what you can see is I have a new button called data feature. So that's because she's got everything. The other thing you'll see is it's been 17 seconds since I logged in, not quite long enough to do a step up. So it's not going to do a step up just yet. But if enough time passes, then it will, do the step up. I'm going to go ahead and log in as somebody else, though, just so we can show that too. So I'm going to go to Bob. And Bob has feature 1. So he is also going to see the feature. So it's going to be Chris, who's the guy that won't see that. We'll just go in as Chris. And Chris has guest and tenant 2, local, and he does not get the feature. Okay, so we see that the tag is allowing me to apply policy at that level. Now that's still going to do a decision per thing. So in order to cache decisions for every single button and area of a page, it becomes interesting. You can imagine I'd rather have just a list of things that I map to the hide show. Might be easier. I've also seen some folks that we've worked with who automatically generate from metadata on their APIs, CI/CD, scripts that will actually deploy all the policies and actually generate tags and things for the UI, so it all ties together. If the API is enabled, then you get the button. So it's kind of, there's so many things that you can do to help automate and tie everything together. But anyway, it's been 53 seconds. Let's see if it works after it's been a little longer, right? Not quite. I'm 1 minute off. Or no, I forgot to enable something. No. Okay, let's see. Recent login, offset, yeah, that's on. Oh, I forgot to do something. Well, you'll just have to trust me that that works, because I probably missed something, so. All right, so just to kind of close up, I've gone through all of this. I think the main thing that I wanted to sort of get to at the end is that, all of the things that we've just talked about are bundling up layers of the authorization story, right? So again, you've got your roles, you've got your permissions, you've got your attributes. If you want to check the time, for example, that would have been an attribute-based, the one that you saw work. And then, context space is more like bundling it all together, where I can go in and I can see, like, if you're in a tenant, for example, like if you went over here and saw, like, whatever, I have, contacts and I have tenants. And if I pin the tenant, then I can start, adding roles to users only within this tenant, and now I've got context, things like that. So the idea of context overlays with all of this. The idea being tenants, projects, workflow, locations, something about the time of day you're supposed to log in, what you're supposed to do. All those things can be, data that goes into the policy evaluation, right? And so you can imagine that it starts to get really complicated. So to sort of isolate, I would say this, we kind of start with the concept of, modeling your roles, permissions, and so on, which could be this idea of what are my areas and features and what roles apply to the feature, and do I have assignments, birthrights, where I assign you the role, or is it conditional based on time of day, or is it, something that's inherited? So essentially there's a legend, or there's what we call toxic combinations. You can't have this if you have that, separation of duties. You can map all that stuff, and there's lots of ways to do it, but you have to kind of do that up front as you're thinking about the plan, because that's the hardest part, is getting that designed up front. And then you got to overlay that with your app and the structure of the app and the features and the sub features, and how are we going to break this up? And are we having 200 APIs and 200 micro UIs? We have some customers that are literally like hundreds of UIs, right? Because they're all micro. So in a very, very large enterprise, that's super hard. But even one application can be complicated. So imagine multiplying that. So you have to really think about it up front. And part of the layers that I like to think about here is that, again, at every single module or feature, you're going to have your CRUD permissions available per resource and things like that you have to map out. And then eventually you're going to map that out to what roles give you those permissions. And then you have to line that up with, well, what resources and then what users that would be applied to, right? How am I grouping these permissions and roles and resources? So this is just a little bit cheat sheet that you might find useful after the fact, but just sort of lays out that at an enterprise level, these are all the things you have to do before you really get to the code, which is the part I showed you earlier, including that last bit that totally worked, So anyway, I just suggest, think about your authorization up front. All the fun code that we do and the samples will be made available is great, but the design is kind of like the first thing and pretty important as well. We could do a whole session on that alone, if not a day. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, thanks.